He thought he had won, leaving her with nothing. But what he didn't know was that his greatest humiliation was about to become his downfall. Many years later, a powerful woman returned to claim what was rightfully hers. By the time he realized what was about to happen, it was already too late. Before you dive into this story with a shocking twist, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories. The grand ballroom of the Ritz Hotel sparkled with the light of 1,000 crystals. The cream of New York society had gathered to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Albrook Construction, one of the largest real estate companies in the country. At the center of attention, Heather Albrook, heiress to the empire and current president of the company, smiled graciously at the guests, her emerald green silk dress reflecting the light of the chandeliers. At 32, Heather was the personification of success. Intelligent, determined, and charming, she had taken control of the company just 3 years ago, after the sudden death of her father, the legendary businessman Charles Albrook. Many doubted her ability to lead such a vast and complex empire, but Heather proved to be more than capable, not only maintaining her father's legacy, but expanding it in ways that even he could not have imagined. By her side, as always, was Richard Matthews, her husband and right-hand man in the company. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with a captivating smile, Richard was the type of man who attracted glances wherever he went. He and Heather made the perfect couple, both in business and in their personal lives. Or at least that's what everyone thought. "Darling, I think it's time for your speech," Richard whispered, his hand resting gently on Heather's back. She nodded, taking one last sip of champagne before heading to the makeshift stage in the center of the ballroom. The murmur of the crowd diminished as Heather climbed the steps, microphone in hand. She smiled, her green eyes scanning the room, finding familiar faces, business partners, longtime friends, rivals disguised as allies, all there to witness the triumph of Albrook Construction. "Good evening, everyone," Heather began, her voice clear and confident echoing through the hall. "It is with immense pleasure and pride that I celebrate with you the 50 years of Albrook Construction, half a century of dedication, innovation, and excellence in the American real estate market." As Heather spoke about the company's history, recalling her father's achievements and projecting a bright future, Richard observed the scene with an enigmatic smile. His eyes, however, were not fixed on his wife, but on a figure at the back of the room, a newly hired young assistant who returned his gaze with discreet winks. "And that's why today I officially announce the launch of our most ambitious project to date, the Albrook Complex," Heather continued, unaware of the exchange of glances between her husband and the assistant. "A development that will redefine the New York skyline and set new standards for sustainability and luxury in North America." Enthusiastic applause filled the room. Heather smiled, feeling the weight of responsibility and the sweet taste of success. Little did she know that this moment would mark the beginning of a turning point in her life, a journey that would take her from the heights of success to rock bottom and back to the top, but this time on her own terms. As she descended from the stage, Heather was immediately surrounded by journalists and businessmen eager for more details about the new project. Richard approached, placing a possessive arm around her waist. "You were incredible up there, love," he whispered in her ear. His hot breath mingled with the aroma of expensive whiskey. Heather smiled, leaning back slightly against him, enjoying the moment of closeness that was becoming increasingly rare in their marriage. "Thank you, Rich. I couldn't have done it without you," she replied, genuinely grateful for the support he had always shown, especially in the first months after her father's loss. The following hours passed in a blur of conversations, toasts, and informal negotiations. Heather circulated through the room with the grace of a queen, while Richard busied himself entertaining the most important investors. From time to time, their gazes crossed through the crowd, a complicit smile being exchanged before each returned their attention to the guests. It was only at the end of the night, when most of those present had already left, that Heather noticed something strange. Richard had been absent for a considerable time. Frowning, she excused herself from the group she was talking to and went out in search of her husband. She walked the corridors of the hotel, checking empty conference rooms and even the men's bathroom, ignoring the surprised looks of the few men who were there. She was about to give up when she heard muffled voices coming from a semi-open service closet. "Rich, we can't—" "Not here," a female voice whispered between giggles. Heather's heart froze. She knew that voice. It was Beth, the new assistant she herself had hired a few weeks ago. "Shh, no one will find us," Richard's unmistakable voice responded, followed by the sound of kisses and sighs. Heather felt the world spin around her. Her first reaction was to open the door and confront them, expose the betrayal right there in front of everyone. But something held her back. A voice in her mind, strangely similar to her father's, whispered, "Keep calm, observe, learn. Knowledge is power." Silently, she moved away from the door, returning to the ballroom with a heavy heart and a whirlwind of thoughts. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. Richard's frequent delays, the secret messages on his cell phone, the sudden interest in participating in events he previously considered boring. Back at the party, Heather kept the smile on her face, although her eyes had lost their sparkle. She watched as Richard returned, discreetly adjusting his tie, followed minutes later by Beth, whose lipstick was slightly smudged. "Where were you?" Heather asked, her voice controlled, when Richard finally joined her. "Oh, just sorting out some last-minute details with the team," he replied, unconcerned. "You know how these events are, there's always something to fix behind the scenes." Heather nodded, pretending to accept the explanation. "Of course, I understand perfectly." The rest of the night passed like a slow-motion nightmare. Heather kept up appearances, smiling and chatting as if nothing had happened, but inside a whirlwind of emotions consumed her. Anger, sadness, humiliation, and surprisingly, a growing determination. As the couple said goodbye to the last guests, Heather made a decision. She would not be just another cheated wife crying in corners. No, she was Heather Albrook, heiress to an empire and a force to be reckoned with. If Richard thought he could play with her like this, he was about to learn a painful lesson. On the way back home, sitting in the back of the limousine next to her husband, Heather began to mentally outline her next steps. She would investigate, gather evidence, and when the right time came, Richard wouldn't know what hit him. "Is everything okay, darling?" Richard asked, noticing his wife's unusual silence. "You seem distant." Heather turned to him, an enigmatic smile playing on her lips. "I'm great, love. Just thinking about the future. I believe interesting times await us." Richard smiled back, completely oblivious to the true meaning behind his wife's words. "Certainly. The Albrook complex will be a milestone in our company's history." "Oh yes," Heather replied, her gaze getting lost in the night landscape of New York passing by the window. "It will be a milestone in many ways." As the limousine wound through the city streets, taking them back to the Albrook mansion, Heather felt a transformation begin within her. The naive heiress who blindly trusted her husband was dying, giving way to a stronger, more astute, and infinitely more dangerous woman. The game had only just begun, and Heather was determined to be the last one laughing. The days following the Albrook construction anniversary party were a test of endurance for Heather. Each morning she woke up next to Richard, forcing a smile and pretending everything was fine. Each goodbye kiss before work now tasted like ashes in her mouth. At the office, Heather closely observed the interactions between Richard and Beth, noticing the furtive glances, the complicit smiles, the meetings that seemed to last longer than necessary. She wondered how long this farce had been happening right under her nose. A week after the party, Heather decided it was time to act. Taking advantage of an afternoon when Richard was in an important meeting outside the office, she called Mark, the company's IT chief, to her office. "Mark, I need a favor," said Heather, closing the door behind him, "and this must stay strictly between us." The man, a bespectacled 40-something with graying hair, nodded nervously. "Of course, Mrs. Albrook. How can I help?" Heather took a deep breath before continuing. "I need you to install monitoring software on Richard's cell phone and laptop. I want access to all messages, emails, and calls." Mark turned pale. "But isn't that illegal?" "Don't worry about the legality," Heather replied, her voice cold as steel. "I take full responsibility. You just need to do what I'm asking." After a few moments of hesitation, Mark agreed. Within hours, Heather had access to Richard's entire digital life. What she discovered left her nauseous. It wasn't just Beth. There were other women, some within the company itself, others from outside. Explicit messages, compromising photos, meetings arranged in hotels. The betrayal was much deeper and older than she had imagined, but the worst was yet to come. Among Richard's emails, Heather found correspondence with lawyers and accountants. He was planning a divorce, but not just any divorce. Richard was maneuvering to remove Heather from the company presidency, alleging incompetence and mismanagement. Sitting in her office, looking at the computer screen with teary eyes, Heather felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. The man she loved, whom she trusted completely, was not only cheating on her but planning to completely destroy her. It was in this moment of deep anguish that Heather heard a soft knock on the door. It was Mrs. Wilson, the secretary who had worked for the Albrook family for decades. "Sorry to bother you, Mrs. Albrook," said the lady, entering the room with a cup of tea. "I thought you might need something to calm your nerves." Heather tried to smile, but the tears finally escaped. Seeing the state of her boss, Mrs. Wilson closed the door and approached, placing a comforting hand on Heather's shoulder. "What happened, my dear?" asked the lady with genuine concern. And so Heather, for the first time since discovering the betrayal, broke down. Between sobs, she told Mrs. Wilson everything: Richard's infidelity, his plans to remove her from the company, the feeling of being completely deceived and betrayed. Mrs. Wilson listened to everything in silence, offering a tissue and words of comfort when necessary. When Heather finished, the old lady surprised her with her words. "Mrs. Albrook, you are Charles Albrook's daughter. You have his blood running through your veins. Your father wouldn't have let himself be defeated by a traitor, and neither will you." Heather looked at Mrs. Wilson, surprised by the strength in her voice. "But what can I do?" asked Heather, feeling lost. "You're going to fight," Mrs. Wilson replied firmly. "You're going to show that scoundrel and all the others who underestimated you what you're capable of. But first, you need to prepare yourself." In the following hours, Heather and Mrs. Wilson drew up a plan. The secretary, who knew all the company's secrets, revealed to Heather details that not even she as president knew. Offshore accounts, shady deals, under-the-table agreements, everything that Charles Albrook had built in the shadows and that Richard now controlled. "You need to act quickly and intelligently," Mrs. Wilson advised. "Richard has powerful allies. If he suspects you know something, he'll accelerate his plans." Heather nodded, feeling a new determination grow within her. "You're right, Mrs. Wilson. I can't let myself be beaten down. I need to be smarter than them." In the days that followed, Heather began to move silently. While maintaining appearances with Richard, she initiated a series of secret meetings with trusted lawyers, private investigators, and even some of her husband's business rivals. A week after the conversation with Mrs. Wilson, Heather was in her office when Richard entered, smiling as always. "Darling, how about we have dinner out tonight?" he asked, approaching for a kiss. Heather smiled, hiding the disgust she felt. "Sure, love. I have a meeting late in the afternoon, but I'm free after that." "Perfect," Richard replied. "I'll pick you up at 8 then." As soon as he left, Heather picked up the phone and dialed a number she had memorized. "Hello, Mr. Mendoza. This is Heather Albrook. I need you to speed up the process we discussed." "Yes, exactly. I want everything ready as soon as possible." Hanging up the phone, Heather leaned back in her chair, looking out the window at the New York skyline. A storm was approaching on the horizon, dark clouds advancing over the skyscrapers. Heather couldn't help but see a metaphor for her own situation. "Let the storm come," she murmured to herself. "I'm ready for it." That night, as she prepared for dinner with Richard, Heather looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes, once full of naivety and trust, now shone with fierce determination. She was no longer just Charles Albrook's heiress. She was a woman ready to fight tooth and nail for what was rightfully hers. The dinner went on normally, with Richard talking about his plans to expand the company. completely unaware that his wife now knew each of his dirty secrets. Heather smiled and nodded, playing the role of the devoted wife to perfection. When they returned home, Richard surprised her with a gift, a diamond necklace from a famous jeweler. "For the most important woman in my life," he said, placing the necklace around Heather's neck. She smiled, touching the cold stones. "It's beautiful, Richard, thank you." That night, lying next to her husband who pretended to sleep, probably exchanging messages with one of his mistresses, Heather made a promise to herself. She would not be just another victim. She would become the architect of her own revenge. The phoenix was rising from the ashes of her naivety, and soon everyone would know what Heather Albrook was really capable of. As the clock struck the early hours of the morning, Heather planned her next move. The war was just beginning, and she was determined to be the last one standing on the battlefield. The weeks that followed were an exercise in self-control for Heather. Each day was a carefully orchestrated performance where she played the role of the dedicated wife and focused businesswoman, while behind the scenes, she meticulously prepared her revenge. On a Wednesday morning, Heather entered the office earlier than usual. The building was practically empty, except for a few cleaning staff and night security guards. She walked to her office, locked the door, and activated the security system she had secretly installed. "Good morning, Mrs. Albrook," Mrs. Wilson's voice sounded through the intercom. The secretary, now a crucial ally of Heather, was on duty even at this unusual hour. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson. Do we have any news?" "Yes, ma'am. Investigator Rodriguez sent the report you requested. It's on your desk." Heather opened the folder, marked confidential, and began to read. The report detailed Richard's activities in recent weeks: clandestine meetings, suspicious negotiations, obscure financial movements. Each page revealed more about the man she thought she knew. "Mrs. Wilson, please schedule a meeting with Mr. Mendoza for this afternoon. Say it's about that matter we discussed." "Yes, ma'am. Anything else?" Heather hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, actually. I need you to get in touch with Melissa Santos from the marketing division. I have a special project in mind." After hanging up, Heather leaned back in her chair, looking out the window at the awakening city. New York, with its chaotic traffic and imposing skyscrapers, seemed a perfect metaphor for her current life, apparently solid, but on the brink of chaos. At 9 o'clock sharp, Richard entered the office, smiling as always. "Good morning, my love. I didn't know you'd come in so early today." Heather smiled back, the mask of loving wife firmly in place. "Good morning, darling. I had some ideas for the Albrook complex and couldn't wait to start working on them." Richard approached, placing a kiss on her cheek. "Always dedicated. That's why I love you so much." Heather felt a knot in her stomach but kept the smile. "I love you too, Rich. Oh, before I forget, we have that dinner with the Chinese investors tonight. Don't be late, please." "Don't worry, I'll be there," Richard replied, already heading to the door. "I have a meeting now. See you later." As soon as he left, Heather picked up the phone. "Mrs. Wilson, please ask Mark to come to my office immediately." Minutes later, the IT chief entered, visibly nervous. "Mrs. Albrook, how can I help you?" "Mark, I need you to do something for me. It's about that special project we discussed." The man swallowed hard but nodded. "What needs to be done?" Heather explained her plan in detail. Mark listened attentively, occasionally asking technical questions. When she finished, he looked even paler than before. "Mrs. Albrook, this is risky. If we get caught—" "We won't," Heather interrupted, her voice firm. "And if something goes wrong, I'll take full responsibility. You have my word." Reluctantly, Mark agreed and left to carry out Heather's instructions. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls. Heather made sure to be seen by everyone, actively participating in discussions about the Albrook complex and other company projects. No one could suspect that behind the facade of normality, a storm was brewing. In the afternoon, Heather met with Mr. Mendoza, her trusted lawyer, at a discreet cafe away from the financial center. "The news isn't good, Mrs. Albrook," said the lawyer, handing her a folder. "Richard has been very careful, Legally, it will be difficult to prove any irregularity. Heather flipped through the documents, her face a mask of calm. I see. And what about the other matter we discussed? Mendoza lowered his voice. It's in progress. But I must warn you, Mrs. Albrook, that once this process is started, there's no turning back. I know, Counselor, and I'm prepared for the consequences. Upon returning to the office, Heather found Melissa Santos, the young and talented marketing chief, waiting for her. Melissa, thank you for coming. I have a special project that I'd like to discuss with you. The two women spent the next hour talking in low voices, with Melissa occasionally taking notes and nodding enthusiastically. This is bold, Mrs. Albrook, said Melissa when they finished. But if it works, it will be revolutionary. Heather smiled, a determined glint in her eyes. That's exactly what I'm counting on, Melissa. Revolutionary. At 7:30 p.m., Heather was impeccably dressed for dinner with the Chinese investors. Richard arrived punctually as promised, looking like the charming and confident businessman as always. You look beautiful, my love, he whispered, offering her his arm. Heather smiled, accepting the gesture. Thank you, darling. Shall we? The Métis. Dinner went smoothly. Heather and Richard acted as the perfect power couple, charming the investors with their vision for the future of Albrook construction. No one could suspect the storm that was forming behind. The smiles and handshakes. Back at the Albrook mansion late at night, Heather watched Richard fall asleep. She knew that soon he would probably get up to exchange messages with one of his mistresses, as he had done in recent nights. Silently, Heather got up and went to her personal office. She turned on the computer and opened an encrypted email from Mark. It's done, the message said. All systems are prepared as requested. Activation will happen at the designated time. Heather took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision. There was no turning back now. The plan was in motion. She typed a short response. Understood. Proceed as planned. Returning to the bedroom, Heather found Richard exactly as she had left him, apparently sleeping. She lay down beside him, but sleep didn't come. Her mind was full of plans, strategies, and surprisingly, memories. She remembered her father, Charles Albrook, and the lessons he had tried to teach her. In the business world, my daughter, he used to say, you need to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than everyone around you. At the time, Heather thought these words were too harsh. Now she understood perfectly what her father meant. As the clock struck the early hours of the morning, Heather made a silent promise to her father's spirit. She would not only survive this ordeal, but would emerge from it stronger than ever. Richard and all the others who had underestimated her would learn the hard way that Heather Albrook was not someone to be trifled with. The dawn would bring a new day, and with it, the beginning of the end for those who dared to betray her. The Phoenix was about to take flight, and the world would tremble at its wings. The sun had barely risen when Heather woke up, her body tense with anticipation of what was to come. Beside her, Richard was still sleeping deeply, oblivious to the storm that was about to crash down on his head. Heather got up silently, took a quick shower, and dressed in one of her most imposing suits, black, impeccably cut, with a red shirt underneath. She was ready for war. She arrived at the office before everyone else, as she had been doing in recent weeks. Mrs. Wilson was already waiting for her, with a cup of strong coffee in hand. Good morning, Mrs. Albrook. Everything is prepared according to your instructions. Heather nodded, taking a sip of coffee. Excellent, Mrs. Wilson. Today is the day. The following hours were a whirlwind of activity. Heather reviewed documents, made calls, and met with her trusted team, a small group of loyal employees she had carefully selected and informed about parts of her plan. At 10 o'clock sharp, Richard entered her office smiling as always. Good morning, my love. Ready for the board meeting? Heather smiled back, her mask of calm firmly in place. Of course, darling. Shall we? The meeting room was packed. Board members, important shareholders, and high-ranking executives anxiously awaited the start of the session. Heather and Richard took their places at the head of the table. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard began, his confident voice echoing through the room, Thank you for your presence at this important meeting. We have much to discuss about the future of Albrook Construction. Heather watched as her husband talked about financial projections, new projects and expansion strategies. She knew it was all a facade, a smokescreen to hide his true plans. When Richard finished his presentation, Heather stood up. Thank you, Richard. Now, if you'll allow me, I'd like to present some additional information that I believe is crucial to the future of our company. Richard gave her a surprised look but nodded, yielding the floor to her. Heather activated the projector, and a series of graphs and documents filled the screen behind her. In recent months, I have conducted a detailed internal audit of all our operations. What I discovered is, to say the least, alarming. A murmur ran through the room. Richard straightened in his chair, a look of confusion on his face. We discovered significant discrepancies in our offshore accounts, Heather continued, her voice firm. Millions of dollars have been diverted to personal accounts and shell companies. The murmur turned into a buzz of shock and indignation. Richard visibly paled. Heather, what are you talking about? He interrupted, trying to maintain his composure. I have no knowledge of any of this. Heather ignored him, continuing her presentation. Furthermore, we found evidence of bribes, bid rigging, and money laundering in several of our most recent projects. The room exploded in raised voices. Shareholders demanded explanations. Board members exchanged worried glances. This is absurd, shouted Richard, standing up. Heather, you can't make such serious accusations without concrete evidence. Heather turned to him, her eyes cold as ice. Oh, but I have evidence, Richard. I have emails, bank transfers, audio recordings, everything. With a click, she displayed on the screen a series of compromising emails, all with Richard's name in the header. His face went livid. This is a setup, he stammered, looking frantically around. The room. She's trying to frame me. But Heather wasn't finished. Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that the illegal actions are not limited to business. I have here, she held up a folder, evidence of multiple extramarital affairs, including with company employees, which constitutes a serious violation of our code of ethics. The room fell into a shocked silence. Richard, who moments before seemed the epitome of confidence, now looked like a cornered animal. Heather, please, he begged, his voice almost a whisper. Don't do this. Ignoring him, Heather addressed the board. In light of these revelations, I propose the immediate removal of Richard Matthews from all his functions at Albrook Construction, pending a full investigation. Chaos broke out in the room. Board members shouted, shareholders demanded immediate action. In the midst of the confusion, Heather remained calm, watching as her plan unfolded exactly as she had foreseen. Richard tried to speak, to defend himself, but his voice was drowned out by the angry crowd. 2 security guards entered the room, positioning themselves beside him. This isn't over, Heather, he hissed as he passed her on his way out. You don't know who you're messing with. Heather stared at him, a slight smile on her lips. On the contrary, Richard, it's you who had no idea who you were dealing with. When the doors closed behind Richard, Heather turned her attention back to the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I know you're all shocked and confused. I assure you that I will take all necessary measures to protect the interests of our company and our shareholders. In the hours that followed, Heather worked tirelessly to calm investors, answer questions from the board, and coordinate with the legal team on the next steps. When she finally returned to her office, it was already night. Mrs. Wilson was waiting for her with a cup of tea. It was impressive, Mrs. Albrook. Your father would be proud. Heather smiled tiredly, accepting the tea. Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. But this was just the beginning. Richard has powerful allies. He will strike back. And you'll be ready when that happens, Mrs. Wilson affirmed confidently. Heather nodded, looking out the window at the illuminated city. She knew she had declared war not just against Richard, but against an entire corrupt system that permeated the business world. It would be a difficult battle, but she was prepared. That night, upon returning to the now empty mansion, Heather allowed herself a moment of reflection. She remembered all the happy moments she had with Richard, the promises of eternal love, the shared dreams, For a brief instant, she felt a pang of pain, but then she remembered the betrayal, the humiliation, how he planned to destroy her. Her determination was renewed. "Let the game begin," she murmured to herself, pouring a glass of wine. The first blow had been struck, but the war was far from over. Heather knew that the following days would be crucial. Richard and his allies would certainly try to retaliate, but she was prepared. The phoenix had risen from the ashes, and now it was time to show the world what she was really capable of. The days following the dramatic board meeting were a veritable whirlwind for Heather. The news of Richard's removal and the corruption allegations spread like wildfire, dominating newspaper headlines and TV newscasts. Heather barely had time to breathe, dividing herself between press conferences, meetings with nervous investors, and strategic sessions with her legal team. But behind her facade of calm and control, she knew that the real battle was just beginning. On the morning of the 5th day after the scandal, Heather was awakened by an urgent call from Mark, the IT chief. "Mrs. Albrook, we have a problem," he said, his voice tense. "There was an attempt to breach our servers during the night." Heather felt a chill run down her spine. "Did they manage to access anything?" "No, our firewalls held, but the attack came from inside, Mrs. Albrook. Someone with internal access is trying to sabotage our systems." "I see," Heather replied, her mind already working on the implications. "Increase security and monitor everything. Don't trust anyone beyond the team we already know." Hanging up the phone, Heather quickly dressed and left for the office. On the way, she called Mrs. Wilson. "Mrs. Wilson, I need you to do something for me. Go to my house and check the safe in my office. There's a red folder inside. Bring it to me immediately, but don't let anyone see you doing it." "Yes, Mrs. Albrook. I'll do it right away." Upon arriving at Albrook Construction, Heather found the building in an uproar. Employees were whispering in corners, apprehensive looks following her wherever she went. Ignoring all this, she went straight to her office, where Mark was waiting with more details about the cyber attack. "We managed to trace the origin of the attack," he explained, showing some graphs on his tablet. "It came from an IP registered to a shell company, but I'm almost certain it was Richard's work." Heather nodded, not really surprised. "He's desperate. He knows we have evidence against him, and he's trying to destroy it." At that moment, Mrs. Wilson entered the room carrying a red folder. "Here it is, Mrs. Albrook, as requested." Heather took the folder, feeling its weight in her hands. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. Please call Mr. Mendoza and ask him to come immediately." When the lawyer arrived, Heather locked the office door and activated the anti-eavesdropping security system she had secretly installed. "Gentlemen," she began, looking at Mark and Mr. Mendoza, "what I'm about to share cannot leave this room." Opening the red folder, Heather revealed a series of documents, photos, and USB drives. "This is what my father called a corporate life insurance. These are proofs of irregularities involving not just Richard, but several of our competitors, and even some high-ranking politicians." Mr. Mendoza's eyes widened. "Mrs. Albrook, this is pure dynamite. If this leaks—" "Exactly," Heather interrupted. "That's why we need to protect this information at all costs. Mark, I want you to create an ultra-secure storage system for this data. Mr. Mendoza, prepare subpoenas and search warrants against Richard and his closest allies. We're going to attack on all fronts." As the two men left to carry out their tasks, Heather found herself alone in her office. Looking out the window at the New York skyline, she couldn't help but think about how drastically her life had changed in such a short time. Her thoughts were interrupted by a notification on her cell phone. It was a message from an unknown number. "You may have won the first battle, Heather, but the war is far from over. I have friends in high places. You have no idea what's coming." Heather felt a shiver but refused to let herself be intimidated. She knew that Richard wouldn't give up easily, but she was prepared to face whatever he threw in her direction. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings, teleconferences, and strategic planning. Heather barely had time to eat, sustaining herself on coffee and pure adrenaline. It was already night when she finally left the office. On the way home, she decided to make a stop. She asked the driver to take her to the pier where Richard's yacht was anchored. Standing on the dock, looking at the luxurious boat that had so often been the stage for happy moments, Heather felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, determination. It was then that she noticed suspicious movement on the deck. Silently, she approached, hiding behind some barrels. To her surprise, she saw Richard in person, carrying several suitcases onto the yacht. "Hurry up," she heard him say to someone inside the boat. "We have to get out of here before the police arrive." Heather's heart raced. Richard was planning to flee. Without thinking twice, she took out her cell phone and called the police, giving precise instructions about the yacht's location. Minutes later, which seemed like hours, sirens began to sound. In the distance. Richard, hearing the noise, panicked. He tried to start the yacht, but it was too late. Heather watched, hidden, as the police arrived and surrounded the boat. Richard was taken away in handcuffs, shouting threats and accusations. When it was all over and the dust had settled, Heather came out of her hiding place. A young police officer recognized her. "Mrs. Albrook, what are you doing here?" Heather smiled tiredly. "Just ensuring that justice is done, officer." Back at her house, Heather finally allowed herself to relax a little. Richard's capture while trying to flee was a significant victory, but she knew that the war was far from over. Pouring herself a glass of wine, she walked to the balcony, looking at the illuminated city. The empire her father had built, that Richard had almost destroyed, was now entirely in her hands. "Dad," she murmured to the starry sky, "I hope you're proud. I promise I won't disappoint you." With a determined sigh, Heather went back inside. Tomorrow would be another day of battle, and she needed to be prepared. The storm might have passed for now, but on the horizon, darker clouds were forming. The Phoenix continued its flight, stronger and more determined than ever. The morning after Richard's arrest dawned with a fine rain over New York, as if the city itself was weeping for the revelations of recent days. Heather woke up early, her eyes heavy from a restless night, but with her mind sharp and ready for the challenges she knew would come. Upon arriving at the office, she found Mrs. Wilson already at her post, with a cup of strong coffee and a stack of newspapers. "Good morning, Mrs. Albrook," said the secretary, handing her the coffee. "The news is everywhere." Heather took a quick look at the headlines. Construction magnate arrested trying to flee the country. Scandal at Albrook Construction. How far does the corruption go? Heather Albrook, heroine or opportunist? Sighing, she entered her office, followed by Mrs. Wilson. "What are today's appointments?" "The board has called an emergency meeting for 10 a.m. Then we have a press conference at 2 p.m. and—" Mrs. Wilson hesitated for a moment. "You received a somewhat unusual meeting request." Heather raised an eyebrow. "Unusual how?" "Anthony Fletcher wants to meet with you, in private." The name made Heather freeze for a moment. Anthony Fletcher was the CEO of Fletcher Enterprises, Albrook Construction's biggest rival. For years, the two companies had waged fierce battles over contracts and land. "Interesting," Heather murmured. "Schedule it for tonight after hours, and Mrs. Wilson, don't record this in the official calendar." The morning passed in a whirlwind of meetings and phone calls. The board, still in shock from recent events, demanded explanations and guarantees. Heather skillfully navigated the difficult questions, reaffirming her commitment to the company's transparency and integrity. The afternoon press conference was even more challenging. Journalists from across the country crowded into the conference room, eager for sordid details and bombshell statements. "Mrs. Albrook," asked a sharp-eyed reporter, "how can we believe that you were not aware of your husband's illegal activities all these years?" Heather maintained her composure, her voice firm as she answered, "I understand the skepticism, but I can assure you that as soon as I had concrete evidence of irregularities, I acted immediately to protect the interests of the company and our shareholders. My commitment has always been and will always be to ethics and transparency." The questions continued for almost 2 hours, becoming increasingly aggressive and personal. Heather answered them all calmly and precisely, without yielding to provocation or losing her composure. When it finally ended, she retreated to her office, exhausted but satisfied with her performance. Looking at the clock, she realized she had only an hour before her secret meeting with Anthony Fletcher. At 8 p.m. sharp, Heather entered a discreet restaurant in the Upper East Side. Anthony was already waiting, a middle-aged man with graying hair and astute eyes. "Heather," he greeted. her standing up to pull out her chair. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." "Anthony," she replied with a nod, "I must admit I was intrigued by your invitation. What can I do for you?" He smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "Straight to the point, as always. It's one of the things I've always admired about you." The waiter approached to take their orders. When he moved away, Anthony leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Heather, I'll be frank. What happened with Richard and Albrook Construction has shaken the entire sector. There are very powerful people very nervous right now." Heather kept her expression neutral. "I imagine so. Corruption tends to make people nervous when exposed." Anthony laughed humorlessly. "You have no idea. Richard's scheme. He wasn't alone. There are politicians, judges, other businessmen involved. People who won't hesitate to destroy you to protect themselves." A chill ran down Heather's spine, but she didn't let it show. "And you're telling me this why exactly?" "Because," he replied, his eyes fixed on hers. "I believe we can help each other." Heather raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "I have information." "Heather, information that can help you protect yourself and consolidate your position. In exchange, I want an alliance. Our companies working together, not against each other." Silence fell between them as the waiter served the wine. Heather took a sip, her mind working furiously. "Why should I trust you, Anthony? We've been rivals." "For years." He smiled, this time a genuine smile. "Because, my dear, sometimes the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And right now, we have common enemies." Heather studied the man in front of her. Anthony Fletcher had always been a formidable adversary, but he also had a reputation for playing fair, unlike many in the business. "What kind of information are we talking about?" she finally asked. Anthony took a USB drive from his pocket and slid it across the table. "In here are emails, bank records, and recordings that implicate several of Richard's friends in his schemes, including some who are planning to move against you in the coming days." Heather picked up the USB drive, feeling its weight in her hand. "And what do you gain from this, besides the alliance between our companies?" "Let's just say I have my own reasons for wanting to see certain people fall," Anthony replied enigmatically. "So do we have a deal?" Heather looked at the USB drive and then back at Anthony. It was risky, she knew. Trusting an old rival could be dangerous, but she also knew that she would need allies to survive the storm that was coming. "We have a deal," she finally said, extending her hand. Anthony shook it, a satisfied smile on his face. "Excellent. Now let's have dinner and discuss the details. We have a lot of work ahead of us." As they began the meal, Heather couldn't help but think about how her life had transformed in a matter of days. From confident wife to CEO at war, from Anthony Fletcher's rival to his ally. The game had changed, and the stakes had never been higher. But one thing she knew for sure: no matter what came, she was ready to fight. The phoenix continued to rise, its wings stronger than ever, ready to face any storm that fate might throw in its path. The sun had barely risen when Heather entered her office at Albrook Construction. The previous night, spent analyzing the information provided by Anthony Fletcher, had been long and disturbing. The content of the USB drive was even more explosive than she had imagined. "Mrs. Wilson," she called through the intercom, "please convene an emergency meeting with our legal and security team, and call Mark from IT as well." While waiting, Heather reviewed her notes. The evidence implicated not only politicians and businessmen in corruption schemes, but also revealed an ongoing plan to destabilize Albrook Construction and force its sale at a bargain price. The group arrived quickly, faces tense and curious. Heather locked the door and activated the anti-eavesdropping security system. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice firm, "what I'm about to share cannot leave this room. We're about to enter a war, and we need to be prepared." Over the next 2 hours, Heather laid out the plan she had elaborated during the night. Mark would be in charge of reinforcing the company's digital security and preparing a cyber counterattack if necessary. The legal team should prepare a series of lawsuits and subpoenas ready to be activated at the slightest sign of movement from the adversaries. "Remember," Heather emphasized, "we can't strike first, But when they attack, and they will attack, we'll be ready to hit back with everything we've got." As soon as the meeting ended, Heather received a call from Anthony Fletcher. "Heather, we have a problem," he said, without preamble. "I just found out that Judge Mendez is going to issue a search and seizure warrant against Albrook Construction today. They're after your father's files." Heather felt her blood run cold. Her father's files contained information that could destroy not just the company but entire lives. "Thanks for the warning, Anthony. I'll take care of it." Hanging up, she immediately activated the contingency plan she had prepared for this exact situation. Mrs. Wilson read code. "Initiate the Phoenix Protocol now." Within minutes, a specialized team began discreetly transferring critical files to secure off-site servers. Simultaneously, a series of fake documents, carefully prepared, were placed in the original's locations. At 2 p.m., as Anthony had predicted, federal agents invaded the Albrook construction building, brandishing search warrants. Heather received them with studied calm. "Gentlemen, we're at your disposal to collaborate with the investigation," she said, her voice serene. "Please, feel free to examine whatever you want." The agents searched the building for hours, taking boxes of documents and hard drives. Heather watched everything, maintaining a neutral expression while internally smiling. They had taken the bait. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, her team worked frantically. Mark and his IT team monitored every digital move of the invaders, collecting information about their methods and origins. The legal team was already preparing a legal counteroffensive based on the illegality of part of the searches. At night, when the agents had finally withdrawn, Heather gathered her trusted team again. "They made the first move," she said, a determined gleam in her eyes. "Now, it's our turn to counterattack." In the days that followed, a series of carefully orchestrated events began to unfold. Strategic leaks of information began to appear in the media, implicating key figures who were behind the attack on Albrook Construction. Heather gave an exclusive interview to a renowned investigative journalist, providing evidence of how the search of her company had been politically motivated. Public opinion, which had previously been divided, began to lean in her favor. Meanwhile, Anthony Fletcher was fulfilling his part of the deal. Using his influence, he began pressuring politicians and businessmen to distance themselves from the conspirators against Heather. The noose was tightening. A week after the search, Heather received an unexpected call. It was the Minister of Justice himself. "Mrs. Albrook," he said, his voice tense, "I'd like to schedule a private meeting with you. We have much to discuss." Heather smiled, knowing that the tide was finally turning. "Of course, Minister. How about tomorrow at my office?" That night, alone in her penthouse, Heather allowed herself a moment of reflection. Looking out the window at the city that never sleeps, she thought about everything that had happened in recent weeks. Richard's betrayal, the struggle to maintain control of the company, unexpected alliances and hidden enemies. Picking up a glass of wine, she made a silent toast to the starry sky. "Dad, I hope you're proud. They tried to bring us down, but they didn't know we're made of something stronger." A soft sound alerted her to a notification on her cell phone. It was a message from an unknown number. "You won this round, Heather, but the game isn't over yet. Take care." Heather stared at the message for a long moment, a chill running down her spine. Whoever her hidden enemy was, they wouldn't give up easily. But neither would she. The phoenix had risen from the ashes once again and now flew higher than ever. The challenges to come would be faced head-on. With one last look at the city that was her battlefield, Heather prepared for bed. Tomorrow would be another day of fighting, and she would be ready. The war was far from over, but Heather Albrook was just beginning to show what she was capable of. The morning arrived with a dense fog hanging over New York, as if the city itself wanted to hide the secrets that were about to come to light. Heather woke up before her alarm, her mind already racing with plans for the crucial day ahead. As she prepared for the meeting with the Minister of Justice, Heather couldn't help but think about the mysterious message she had received the night before. Who could be behind that veiled threat? The list of suspects was long, and each name brought with it a complex web of possibilities and dangers. Arriving at the office, Heather found Mrs. Wilson already at her post, with a cup of strong coffee and a concerned look. "Good morning, Mrs. Elbrook." The minister called to confirm the meeting, and "There's one more thing." Heather raised an eyebrow, taking the coffee. "What is it, Mrs. Wilson?" The secretary hesitated for a moment before continuing. "A woman called earlier insisting on speaking with you. She said it was urgent and that she had information about your father." Heather's heart skipped a beat. "My father? Did she say who she was?" "No, ma'am. She just left a contact number and said her name was Martha." Heather frowned. The name meant nothing to her. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. Please don't put through any more calls until the minister arrives." Locked in her office, Heather tried to focus on preparing for the meeting, but her mind kept going back to the mysterious Martha. What could she know about Charles Albrook that Heather didn't? At 10 a.m. sharp, the Minister of Justice, Robert Alvarez, entered the conference room of Albrook Construction. He was an imposing man, middle-aged, with astute eyes that seemed to assess everything around him. "Mrs. Albrook," he greeted, shaking Heather's hand firmly, "thank you for receiving me on such short notice." "Minister Alvarez," Heather replied, indicating a chair. "The pleasure is mine. How can I help you?" The minister settled in, his face a mask of seriousness. "Mrs. Albrook, I'll get straight to the point. The accusations you've made about the political motivation behind the search of your company are serious, very serious." Heather kept her expression neutral. "They're not accusations, Minister. They're facts, backed by concrete evidence." Alvarez studied her for a long moment before continuing. "I see, and that's why I'm here. You must understand that these revelations have the potential to shake the foundations of the government. We need to handle this discreetly." "Discreetly," Heather repeated, a touch of irony in her voice. "And how do you suggest we do that?" The minister leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I have a proposal for you. The government is willing to offer full protection to Albrook Construction, plus lucrative contracts for the coming years. In exchange, we ask that you reconsider the disclosure of certain information." Heather felt a wave of indignation course through her body, but maintained her composure. "Are you asking me to cover up crimes, Minister?" "I'm asking you to think of the greater good, Mrs. Albrook," he replied, his voice firm. "Sometimes, to maintain stability, certain sacrifices are necessary." For a moment, Heather found herself tempted. The minister's offer would mean security for her company, for her employees. But then she remembered her father, everything he had built, the principles he had taught her. "I'm sorry, Minister," she said finally, standing up, "but I can't accept your proposal. The truth will come out, whatever the cost." Alvarez's face hardened. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Albrook, a mistake that could cost you dearly." "Perhaps," Heather replied, opening the door of the room. "But it's a price I'm willing to pay." As soon as the minister left, Heather called Mrs. Wilson. "Please give me the number of that woman, Martha, and cancel all my appointments for the rest of the day." Minutes later, Heather was on the phone. "Hello, Martha? This is Heather Albrook. You said you had information about my father." The voice on the other end of the line was hoarse, as if it belonged to someone who had smoked for decades. "Heather, finally. Yes, I have information. Information that your father wanted you to have when the time came. And I believe that time is now." Heather felt a lump form in her throat. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" "Someone who knew your father very well," Martha replied. "Meet us tonight at 8 p.m. at Café Columbia. Come alone." Before Heather could ask more questions, the line went dead. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Heather tried to focus on work, but her mind kept going back to the mysterious call. Who was Martha? What secrets of her father did she hold? At 7:45 p.m., Heather parked her car a block away from Café Columbia. The place was an old establishment, almost hidden on a narrow street in the old downtown area. As she entered, the aroma of roasted coffee and the soft murmur of conversations enveloped her. In a corner table, an elderly woman waved discreetly. Heather approached, her heart racing. "Martha?" she asked, sitting down. The woman nodded, her tired eyes studying Heather attentively. "You're the spitting image of your father, you know. You have the same determined eyes." "How did you know my father?" Heather asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Martha smiled sadly. "Oh dear, I was much more than just an acquaintance. I was Charles Albrook's biggest secret, and you, Heather, are the living proof of that secret." Heather felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. What do you mean?" Martha reached into her bag, pulling out a yellowed envelope. "Your father asked me to give this to you when the time was right. I believe that time is now." With trembling hands, Heather took the envelope. Inside there was a letter and an old photo. In the photo, a young Charles Albrook smiled next to a woman who was unmistakably a younger version of Martha. "Heather," Martha said softly, "there's much you don't know about your true history, and about the history of Albrook Construction. Are you ready to hear the truth?" Heather looked from the photo to Martha, feeling that she was on the brink of a revelation that would change everything. With her heart racing and her mind in turmoil, she nodded. The night promised to be long, and the revelations that were to come would shake the very foundations upon which Heather had built her life and her struggle. Café Columbia seemed to have disappeared around Heather and Martha. The buzz of conversations, the clinking of cups, everything transformed into a distant noise as Heather absorbed the words of the woman in front of her. "Your father and I met almost 40 years ago," Martha began, her voice laden with emotion. "I was a secretary at a small construction company he acquired early in his career. We fell in love, but Charles was already married to your mother." Heather felt a lump form in her throat. "You had an affair?" Martha nodded slowly. "It was more than an affair, Heather. It was a deep and complicated love that lasted for years, and from that love you were born." The world seemed to spin around Heather. "What? No, this can't be true. My mother, the woman you knew as your mother, couldn't have children," Martha explained gently. "When I got pregnant, Charles saw an opportunity. He and Elizabeth convinced me to give you to them after birth. In exchange, Charles promised that I would always be part of your life, even if from a distance." Heather felt hot tears streaming down her face. Her entire life, her entire identity seemed to be crumbling before her eyes. Why are you telling me this now?" she managed to ask between sobs. Martha took Heather's hands in hers. "Because your father knew this day would come. The day you would face powerful forces that would try to destroy everything he built. And he wanted you to know the truth, to fully understand the legacy you're protecting." With trembling hands, Heather opened the letter Martha had given her. Her father's familiar handwriting jumped off the page. "My dear Heather, if you're reading this, it means the moment I so feared and, at the same time, knew was inevitable has arrived. The moment when the truth about your origins and about the true nature of Albrook Construction would need to come to light. First, I need you to know that, despite the circumstances of your birth, you have always been and will always be my beloved daughter. Every moment I spent with you was a gift, and my love for you is the truest and purest thing I've ever felt." Now about the company. Albrook Construction is not just a construction company, Heather. It's the facade for something much larger and more complex. For decades, we've used our influence and resources to protect important people, guard state secrets, and sometimes shape the very course of our country's history. I know this may seem scary, perhaps even morally questionable, but believe me, when I say that we have always acted with the aim of protecting and serving the greater good. The files you so bravely protected contain information that could destabilize entire nations if they fell into the wrong hands. Heather, you're not just fighting for a company. You're fighting for a legacy of protection and balance that goes far beyond the business world. The enemies you face are not just corrupt businessmen or greedy politicians. They are people who want to dismantle decades of careful work that has maintained peace and stability in situations you can't even imagine. Trust. Martha, she knows the details that I could never share with you before. She will be your guide in this new world that is opening up before you. Always remember, you are stronger than you think, more capable than you imagine. You are my daughter, my living legacy. I trust you to continue the work I started. With all my love, your father, Charles. Heather let the letter fall onto the table, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and thoughts. She looked at Martha, who was watching her with a mixture of apprehension and compassion. It's madness, Heather finally managed to say. Are you telling me that Albrook Construction is some kind of secret organization? Martha sighed deeply. It's more complicated than that, Heather. Your father created a network of influence and protection that goes far beyond what you can imagine. The construction industry was just the tip of the iceberg. And now, what do you expect me to do with this information? Heather asked, feeling lost. Now, Martha replied, leaning forward, you need to decide if you're ready to truly take on your father's legacy. Not just the company, but everything that comes with it. The responsibilities, the secrets, the dangers. Heather remained silent for long moments, absorbing everything she had discovered. Her entire life had been built on a web of secrets and half-truths. And now, in the midst of a battle for the survival of everything she knew, she discovered that the battlefield was much larger and more complex than she had ever imagined. I need time, she finally said. I need to think, to process all of this. Martha nodded understandingly. Of course, dear, but we don't have much time. Your father's enemies, the people who want to destroy everything he built, they won't wait. You need to be ready. As they stood to leave the cafe, Heather felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. The revelations of this night had changed everything. Her fight was no longer just for Albrook Construction, but for something much bigger, something she still barely understood. As they said goodbye, Martha held Heather's face between her wrinkled hands. You have your father's strength and my determination, Heather. I have no doubt that you are capable of facing what's to come. Heather nodded, tears in her eyes. Thank you, Mom. The word came out hesitantly, strange in her mouth, but somehow right. As she walked back to her car, Heather knew she was on the brink of a new phase in her life, a phase full of dangers, secrets, and responsibilities that she never imagined she would have to face. But one thing was certain, the phoenix within her was ready to take flight once again, now with an even greater purpose. Charles Albrook's legacy would live on through her, and Heather was determined to honor it no matter the cost. Heather barely slept that night. Her mind was racing with Martha's revelations, her father's words echoing incessantly in her thoughts. When the sun finally rose, she was already up, facing the awakening city through the window of her penthouse. All right, she murmured to herself. It's time to act. Her first step was to call an emergency meeting with her innermost circle of trust, Mrs. Wilson, Mark from IT, and Mr. Mendoza, her lawyer. As they arrived in her office, they all immediately noticed the change in Heather. There was a new aura of determination and strength emanating from her. Ladies and gentlemen, Heather began, closing the door, what I'm about to share goes beyond any confidentiality we've discussed before. Are you prepared to hear something that could completely change the way you see not just this company, but the world around us? The three exchanged apprehensive glances before nodding in agreement. Over the next 2 hours, Heather revealed everything she had discovered about the true nature of Albrook Construction, omitting only the most personal details about her own origin. The reactions ranged from Mark's absolute shock to Mrs. Wilson's silent understanding. This explains a lot, commented Mr. Mendoza, adjusting his glasses. I always suspected there was more to the company than it appeared, but this is beyond anything I could have imagined. And now, Mrs. Albrook, asked Mrs. Wilson, her voice as steady as ever, what's the next step? Heather took a deep breath before responding. Now we're going to counterattack, not just to save the company, but to protect everything my father built over decades. We need to identify our true enemies and neutralize them before it's too late. The rest of the day was dedicated to elaborating a meticulous plan. Mark was put in charge of further reinforcing the company's digital security, creating an ultra-secret parallel network for the most sensitive communications. Mr. Mendoza began preparing a series of strategic legal actions designed to protect Albrook Construction's interests on multiple fronts. Meanwhile, Heather met again with Martha, this time in an even more discreet location. The woman she now knew to be her biological mother brought with her a suitcase full of documents and electronic devices. "These are your father's secret files," Martha explained, handing the suitcase to Heather. "Here you'll find information on every secret operation, every hidden alliance, every potential threat. Use them wisely, Heather. The power contained here is both a blessing and a curse." Heather nodded solemnly, feeling the weight of responsibility in her hands. "Thank you, Martha, for everything." In the days that followed, Heather dove deep into the hidden world her father had built. Each new discovery left her more perplexed and, at the same time, more determined. Albrook Construction's network of influence extended through governments, multinational corporations, and even international organizations. A week after Martha's revelations, Heather was ready to take the next step. She called a press conference, announcing a series of anti-corruption and transparency measures at Albrook Construction. What the public didn't know was that each announcement, each new policy, was carefully designed to send coded messages to the real players behind the scenes. The reaction was immediate. Politicians began to move nervously. Rival businessmen made hasty statements to the press. And, as Heather had predicted, her hidden enemies began to emerge from the shadows. The first strike came in the form of a massive cyber attack against Albrook Construction's systems, but Mark and his team were prepared. Not only did they repel the attack, but they managed to trace its origin to a group of hackers hired by a rival corporation. "Excellent work, Mark," Heather praised upon receiving the report. "Now let's use this to our advantage." With the information obtained, Mr. Mendoza prepared a series of lawsuits against the rival corporation, while Heather used her newly discovered contacts to apply pressure behind the scenes. The counterattack didn't stop there. Using her father's secret files, Heather began to dismantle one by one the threats against Albrook Construction. Alliances were forged, enemies were neutralized, and gradually the noose began to tighten around the true architects of the conspiracy against her. On a particularly tense night, Heather received an anonymous call. "Impressive, Ms. Albrook," said a male voice on the other end of the line. "You've proven to be a much more formidable adversary than we expected." "Who's speaking?" asked Heather, maintaining her calm. "Let's just say I'm someone who gravely underestimated Charles Albrook's legacy. We're willing to negotiate a peace agreement." Heather smiled, feeling that she was finally turning the game around. "Very well. Let's talk." In the weeks that followed, Heather navigated a minefield of secret negotiations, veiled threats, and unlikely alliances. Each move was calculated. Each decision weighed the fate not just of the company, but potentially of the entire country. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of struggle, Heather called another press conference. This time her announcement shook the market. Albrook Construction was merging with two other industry giants, creating an unprecedented conglomerate in the country's history. What the public didn't know was that this merger represented much more than a simple market move. It was the culmination of months of behind-the-scenes negotiations, a careful redistribution of power and influence that Heather had meticulously orchestrated. That night, alone in her office, Heather allowed herself a moment of reflection. She looked at her father's photo on the wall, feeling a mixture of pride and melancholy. "We did it, Dad," she whispered. "Your legacy is safe." A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Martha. "You've done an incredible job, my daughter," she said, entering the room. "Charles would be proud." Heather smiled, feeling tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Mom." The two women embraced, a moment of connection that transcended decades of secrets and separation. As night fell over New York, Heather knew her journey was far from over. New challenges would arise, new threats would emerge from the shadows, but now she was ready. The Phoenix had not only been reborn, it had transformed into something more powerful and resilient than it had ever been, and Heather Albrook was ready to face any storm the future might bring. The rising sun painted new, York's horizon with hues of gold and pink, as Heather entered her office in the newly formed Albrook Global Enterprises. The merger she had orchestrated over the past months transformed Albrook Construction into a conglomerate of impressive proportions, extending its influence far beyond the construction sector. Mrs. Wilson was already at her post, as always, with a steaming cup of coffee and a look that mixed pride and concern. "Good morning, Mrs. Albrook. The reports you requested are on your desk, and there's one more thing." Heather raised an eyebrow, taking the coffee. "What is it, Mrs. Wilson?" The secretary hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Richard has made contact. He wants to speak with you." The name of her ex-husband made Heather freeze for an instant. Richard had been released from prison a few weeks ago, benefiting from a plea bargain agreement. Since then, he had kept a low profile, away from the spotlight. "What does he want?" asked Heather, her voice cautious. "He didn't say, ma'am, just that it was urgent and personal." Heather pondered for a moment. Part of her wanted to ignore the request, to leave the past behind. But another part, the part her father had trained to see beyond the obvious, knew she couldn't afford to ignore any potential threat or opportunity. "Very well, Mrs. Wilson. Schedule a meeting for this afternoon on neutral ground." The following hours were filled with meetings and teleconferences. The merger was still in its initial phase, and there were 1,000 details to be worked out. Heather navigated it all with a mixture of business acumen and newly acquired wisdom about Albrook's true role behind the scenes of power. At 3 p.m., Heather found herself in a discreet cafe in the city center. Richard was already there, looking smaller and older than she remembered. His eyes, once full of confidence and charm, now carried a weight that Heather knew well, the weight of secrets and consequences. "Heather," he greeted her, standing up. "Thank you for coming." She nodded, sitting down. "What do you want, Richard?" He took a deep breath before speaking. "First, I want to apologize. I know words can't undo what I did, but—" "Spare me," Heather interrupted, her voice cold. "You didn't call me here to apologize. What do you really want?" Richard seemed to deflate a bit in the face of her harshness. "So you're right, as always. Heather, I'm here to warn you. Things are happening, things that not even you, with all your new power and influence, can imagine." Heather felt a chill run down her spine, but maintained her composure. "Explain yourself." "During my time away," he chose his words carefully, "I made contacts, I heard things. There's a group, Heather, a group that makes Albrook look like a backyard company in comparison." "What group?" asked Heather, her curiosity piqued. Richard looked around nervously before continuing. "They call themselves the Consortium. They're an international organization with tentacles in every imaginable sector, and they have Albrook in their sights." Heather processed the information, her mind working furiously. Was this true, or just another of Richard's manipulations? "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, studying him carefully. Richard smiled sadly. "Because despite everything, I still care about you, Heather, and because I know that if anyone can face this threat, it's you." Before Heather could respond, her cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Mark. "Urgent. We detected a massive security breach. All systems compromised." Heather felt her blood run cold. She looked at Richard, who was watching her with a mixture of apprehension and something else. "Recognition?" "You knew," she said. "It wasn't a question." Richard nodded slowly. "They used me as bait, Heather, forgive me." At that moment, chaos broke out in the cafe. Men in suits invaded the place, guns drawn. Heather reacted instinctively, knocking the table over onto Richard and rolling behind a pillar. "Heather Albrook," an authoritative voice echoed through the environment. "In the name of the consortium, you are under custody." Heather's mind was working at 1,000 miles per hour. All her instincts screamed for her to flee, but she knew that would only worsen her situation. With a resigned sigh, she came out from behind the pillar, hands raised. "I'm cooperating," she said, her voice firm. "But know that you're making a grave mistake." As she was escorted out of the cafe, Heather saw Richard being taken in another direction. Their gazes met for a brief moment, and she saw in him a mixture of guilt and hope. In the car that was taking her to an unknown destination, Heather closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Everything she had fought for in recent months seemed to be crumbling. But amidst the chaos, a voice in her mind, which sounded strangely like her father's, whispered, "Remember, my daughter, the phoenix always rises from the ashes. This is not the end. Here's just the beginning of a new battle." And with that certainty burning in her chest, Heather opened her eyes, ready to face whatever fate had in store for her. The game had changed once again, but she was determined to emerge victorious, no matter the cost. The armored vehicle wound its way through the streets of New York, taking Heather to an unknown destination. Through the darkened windows, she observed the city she loved so much pass by in a blur, feeling a mixture of apprehension and determination grow within her. After what seemed like hours, the car finally stopped. Heather was escorted into an imposing building, its architecture a blend of modernity and opulence. The discreet logo at the entrance simply said, "Global Consortium." In the elevator, accompanied by two men in suits, Heather tried to maintain her calm, her mind working furiously to understand the situation and plan her next steps. The doors opened to reveal a luxurious conference room. In the center, a large oval table made of fine wood, around which sat 5 people, 3 men and 2 women, all emanating an aura of power and authority that made Heather immediately understand she was in the presence of the true masters behind the scenes. "Ms. Albrook," one of the men spoke, rising to greet her. His accent was indefinable, a mixture of several cultures. "Welcome to the consortium. Please have a seat." Heather took her place, maintaining an upright posture and a firm gaze. "I believe you owe me some explanations." One of the women with grey hair and penetrating eyes smiled slightly. "Actually, Ms. Albrook, it's you who owes us explanations. Your recent actions have drawn our attention in an inopportune manner." "Inopportune?" Heather repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Forgive me, but it was you who hacked my systems and kidnapped me in broad daylight." The man who had greeted her initially made a dismissive gesture. "Mere necessary inconveniences for this conversation. Heather, may I call you Heather? You need to understand the magnitude of the situation you find yourself in." He pressed a button, and a giant screen lit up on the wall, showing a complex network of connections between companies, governments, and individuals around the world. At the center of this web, to Heather's surprise, was the logo of Albrook Global Enterprises. "What your father built," the man continued, "is much more than a simple construction company disguised as a secret organization. Albrook is a crucial node in a global network of power and influence, a network that we, the consortium, have taken centuries to weave." Heather felt her head spin with the implications of what she was hearing. "Centuries? Are you telling me that?" "That we've existed for much longer than you can imagine," the grey-haired woman completed. "Yes, Heather. The consortium has been shaping the course of world history for generations. Wars, revolutions, technological advances, all part of a greater plan." "And where exactly does Albrook fit into this plan?" asked Heather, struggling to maintain her composure in the face of such shocking revelations. A third member of the group, a man with Asian features, leaned forward. "Your father, Heather, was a visionary. He understood the potential of North America as a testing ground for our initiatives. Albrook became our anchor in the region, a crucial foothold for our global operations." Heather took a deep breath, processing everything she was hearing. Part of her wanted to deny, to reject the idea that everything she believed in was just a small piece in a much larger game. But another part, the part that had inherited her father's astuteness, was beginning to see the connections, the opportunities. "And what do you want from me?" she finally asked. The first man smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We want you to continue your father's work, Heather, but on a much larger scale. You've proven to be capable, resilient, a true force to be reckoned with. The consortium needs someone like you to lead our operations, not just in North America, but globally." Heather felt the weight of the offer, the magnitude of what was being proposed. It was power beyond anything she had ever imagined, influence that transcended borders and governments. But then, like a flash, she remembered everything she had fought for in recent months. The integrity she had sought to restore to her father's company, the promises she had made to herself, to use her power for good. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with tension. "Heather," said the grey-haired woman, her voice soft but with an underlying threat, "you must understand that there isn't really an option to refuse. What we offer is not just an opportunity, but a necessity, for your own protection and that of all those you love." At that moment, Heather fully understood the situation she found herself in. It wasn't just her life or her company that was at stake, but potentially the fate of entire nations. With her heart racing but her mind clear, Heather slowly stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen of the consortium, I appreciate your offer. But before I give my answer, I need time. Time to fully understand what you're proposing and the implications of my decision." The consortium members exchanged glances, a silent conversation happening between them. Finally, the first man nodded. "Very well, Heather. You'll have 48 hours to consider our proposal. But remember, the world doesn't stop turning while you decide. Choose wisely." As she was escorted out of the building, back to the familiar streets of New York, Heather felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. The next 48 hours would be the most crucial of her life. The Phoenix was about to face its greatest challenge yet, and Heather knew that her decision would affect not just her destiny, but potentially the course of world history. The 48 hours granted by the consortium passed like a whirlwind for Heather. As soon as she was released, she isolated herself in her penthouse, turning off all electronic devices and instructing Mrs. Wilson not to allow any interruptions except in case of extreme emergency. Heather needed to think, and think clearly. 3. Consortium's revelations had shaken the foundations of everything she believed she knew about her father, about Albrook, and about the very workings of the world. It was as if suddenly she had been introduced to a parallel reality, one where the true levers of power operated in the shadows, moved by invisible hands. Sitting on her balcony, observing the New York skyline, Heather recalled her entire journey, from Richard's betrayal, through the discovery of her father's secrets, to the present moment. Each step, each decision, seemed to have inevitably led her to this crucial point. On the second day of her seclusion, Heather received an unexpected visit. Martha, her biological mother, appeared at her door, her eyes heavy with concern. "Heather, my daughter," said Martha, embracing her. "I sensed something was wrong. What happened?" For hours, Heather poured out her heart, sharing with Martha everything she had discovered about the consortium and the offer that had been made to her. Martha listened in silence, her face a mask of understanding and, surprisingly, resignation. "I feared this day would come," Martha finally spoke, her voice tired. "Your father, he always knew the consortium existed, always feared that one day they would come after you." Heather felt a pang of frustration. "And why did he never tell me? Why leave me to discover all this on my own?" Martha took Heather's hands in hers. "Because he wanted you to have a choice, my dear. He wanted you to build your own life, make your own decisions, without the weight of this knowledge." "And what choice do I have now?" asked Heather, her voice breaking slightly. "They made it clear that there's no option to refuse." Martha smiled sadly. "There's always a choice, Heather. Your father taught me that. The question is, are we willing to bear the consequences of our choices?" Martha's words echoed in Heather's mind for the rest of the day and through the following night. As the hours ticked away, she found herself facing the biggest crossroads of her life. On one hand, accepting the consortium's offer would mean power and influence beyond her most ambitious dreams. She could shape the destiny of nations, influence the course of history. But at what cost? Becoming part of an organization that operated in the shadows, manipulating lives like pieces on a global chessboard. On the other hand, refusing could mean not just the end of everything she had built, but potentially putting herself and those she loved in danger. The consortium had made it clear that they were not used to being denied. As the deadline approached, Heather made her decision. She would meet with the consortium again, but on her own terms. She spent the last few hours meticulously preparing her strategy, drawing on everything she had, learned from her father and her own experiences. When the time came, Heather entered the consortium's building with her head held high, radiating a confidence that surprised even the impassive security guards. In the conference room, the same 5 individuals awaited her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and impatience. "Well, Heather," the man who seemed to be the leader spoke. "Have you made your decision?" Heather took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping across each face in the room. "I have. But before I give you my answer, I have some conditions of my own." A murmur of surprise ran through the room. This was clearly not what they had expected. "Conditions?" the gray-haired woman asked, her voice a mix of amusement and irritation. "You don't seem to understand your position, Ms. Albrook." "On the contrary," Heather replied, her voice steady. "I understand it perfectly, and that's exactly why I'm in a position to negotiate." For the next hour, Heather laid out her proposal. She would join the consortium, but Albrook would maintain a degree of autonomy. She demanded transparency on certain operations, a seat at the highest level of decision-making, and most importantly, the power to veto actions she deemed unethical or harmful to the greater good. As she spoke, Heather could see the expressions of the consortium members changing. What had started as skepticism slowly transformed into grudging respect, and in some cases, outright admiration. When she finished, silence fell over the room. The consortium members exchanged glances, engaged in a silent communication that Heather couldn't decipher. Finally, the leader spoke. "You've given us much to consider, Heather. Your proposal is unprecedented. We'll need time to discuss this among ourselves." Heather nodded, standing up. "Take all the time you need. But remember, just as you gave me a deadline, I'm giving you one as well. You have 24 hours to accept my terms or I walk away and take all of Albrook's resources and secrets with me." As she left the building, Heather felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror. She had just gambled everything on a bold move, and now all she could do was wait. The next 24 hours were the longest of Heather's life. She spent them preparing for every possible outcome, from full acceptance of her terms to outright retaliation from the consortium. When the call finally came, Heather was ready. The consortium had accepted most of her terms, with a few minor adjustments. She was now not just a member, but a key player in one of the most powerful secret organizations in the world. As she stood on her penthouse balcony that night, looking out over the city she loved, Heather felt the weight of her new responsibilities settling on her shoulders. She had entered a new world, one filled with shadows and secrets, but also with the potential to effect real change on a global scale. The phoenix had not just risen from the ashes, it had soared to heights it had never before imagined. And Heather, Albrook was ready for whatever challenges this new chapter of her life might bring. As the lights of New York twinkled below her, Heather raised a glass in a silent toast to her father's memory. "I hope I've made you proud, Dad," she whispered. "The game has changed, but I promise to play it well." With renewed determination, Heather turned back to her apartment. Tomorrow would bring the dawn of a new era, not just for her, but potentially for the world, and she was ready to face it head-on.